the public has caught on to the idea that whereas tax cuts in the 1980s may have sounded like, hey, I'm a regular person, I'm going to really benefit from high-income tax cuts, that the sales pitch doesn't work as well anymore.
Anti-tax turns into anti-government very, very quickly.
Yeah, and
that is where we are.
To the third hour of our program, y'all know the Lever, levernews.com is the website, David Sirota's publication. David's been a guest on this program many, many times over the years, my old Air America colleague, in fact. And they just rolled out a brand new podcast series, and the very first one has me in it, which was quite an honor. And Natalie Bettendorf has been doing that work. And so on the line with us are both David Sirota and Natalie Bettendorf. And guys, it's great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us. David, if I could start with you, the Lever is kind of your project. Tell us about this new podcast series.
Sure. It's about the history of the anti-tax movement, or at least the modern anti-tax movement, and how it came to dominate American politics. So it tells the story of what has led up to and is really culminating in the now debate over essentially making permanent Donald Trump's massive tax cuts for the wealthy. And so this story really starts in the 1970s, and it starts and obviously moves into, it gets supercharged in the 1980s. But in the episode that was just out this week, and it's a mini series, so I encourage people to go check it out, and you can download it at levernews.com. It starts out with this conservative theory of the Santa Claus of tax cuts, that the conservative movement at the time, sort of out of power, post Watergate, post the landslide election defeat of Barry Goldwater, the conservative movement kind of in the wilderness, comes up with this idea that to counter Democrats' Santa Claus of spending, the New Deal spending on programs, Democrats always offering the public good things that the public wants, that the conservative movement should frame tax cuts as their own version of Santa Claus. And of course, they find their Santa Claus in Ronald Reagan.
Right. And then the secondary job, as Judah Winniski laid out back in 76, I think it was, is to force the Democrats to shoot their Santa in the face.
Right.
Natalie Bettendorf, it was a real pleasure being interviewed by you for this. You clearly have done your homework on it. I've been yelling about this Two Santa Claus theory for decades. I don't know that anybody else has really documented it. How did you learn about this? And you know, what sort of background is there out there that where people can educate themselves about the Two Santa Claus theory and Judah Winniski and all this other stuff?
Well, Thom, I think what I realized in my reporting and what was very apparent to me quickly is that, Reaganomics is something we hear, that term to describe supply side economics, right? And that it is so tied to Reagan's economic policy. But what I uncovered and our team was looking into was actually there was this team of people, right, behind President Reagan in his 2 terms as president to formulate this theory, both the Santa Claus theory, but broadly, right, the theory of supply side economics, that school of thought. And so I think what is the most fascinating part of all of this to me is that Reagan had to be convinced, right? He was not sold on this idea either that, wealth could trickle down from the top through method of these tax cuts and get to people at the bottom. And I think that the idea that Reagan needed a team of people behind him, including Judah Winniski, Jack Kemp, Arthur Laffer, right? This team of people who were very powerful and didn't know how powerful they could be in shaping the trajectory of, the GOP going forward, but also the future of American politics. And that just was absolutely, enthralling to me and my team. And we realized that this needed to be multiple episodes, not just one episode, to really dig into the story of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and you've done a brilliant job with it. David Sirota, one of the things that blows my mind about trickle-down economics is that in the 1890s, I think it was the McKinley election, and in the 1920 election, the Warren Harding election, both of these happening when cars were more of a rarity. By 1920, they were far more common, but certainly there was still, most small towns in America still had streets with horse poop along the streets because people were still riding horses, and there was a precursor to trickle-down economics. It was called the horse and sparrow theory. And, the Republicans were big fans of this back in the 1800s, the late 1800s, that if you feed a horse more oats than he can normally digest, he will pass through his digestive system a lot of undigested oats, and then those cow patties or horse patties that would get left behind on the street will be occupied by little sparrows picking out the undigested oats, and that's how the wealthy, if wealthy people are allowed to, if we can have the Roaring '20s here, it's going to help out the average person. It's amazing, isn't it?
It is, and I think what we're living through now is that the Santa Claus theory, I think, may be starting to fray. Because I think when we look at polls right now, the public has kind of caught on to the idea that they hear about the Santa Claus of tax cuts from Republican presidents, but their stockings are left empty. While the billionaires are getting all the gifts from the Santa Claus of tax cuts, the general public, everyone else, is not actually benefiting. And we looked in a recent op-ed about this tax series at where Republican tax cut proposals started in the first terms of Republican presidents. And what you see is that while Reagan's first tax proposals were quite popular when he started, they were Republican proposals for tax cuts were much less popular under George W. Bush. They were even less popular under the first term of Donald Trump. And they're even more unpopular, according to polls. The idea of extending those to 2017 tax cuts are even more unpopular than before. So it seems to me that over the generations which is why I think you're starting to see, even in Congress, members of the Republican Party are floating the idea of maybe a millionaire's tax. Mm-hmm. There's a new poll out that shows 70% of Republican voters believe that taxes need to be increased on the wealthy. So I think the Santa Claus theory may finally be starting to fray.
Yeah, and a fine thing it is. Natalie Bettendorf, the first half of the Two Santa Claus theory was Republicans need to match Democrats in giving stuff away. They get to be the Santa Claus of tax cuts. The second half was Republicans need to figure out how to force Democrats to shoot their Santa in the face, the Santa of Social Security or Medicare or unemployment insurance or the minimum wage or whatever it may be. Tell us about that. How did the GOP think that they could force Democrats to shoot Santa in the face? And how did that work out with the Clinton administration?
Yeah, I mean, Thomas, you've written about, I think what people don't know, the term that comes up over and over again when looking at how supply side was battled behind the scenes, it's about deficits, right? It's about what these politicians and what people in Congress were able to sell to the rest of Congress, to the American public, of how to deal with the problem of deficits, right? Because if you are executing these tax cuts, as was done in the 70s into the 80s and onwards, what you're seeing is that rising deficit. And Republicans used to be those balanced budgeting Scrooges, right? They were really known for making sure they wanted to keep that deficit at bay. And so I think what we saw was, this deficit was skyrocketing once Reagan left his second term, and we came into Bush's term, and we see in the 90s, right, that rising deficit, and it seems that this balancing aspect has just gone completely awry. And so I think that what is really important for people to understand when trying to understand the trajectory of American tax policy and its foundational pieces in the 80s, as Reagan is coming out, is really understanding that this shooting Santa in the face is really about keeping the American public focused on money that is coming back into their pockets and not going to the government. And in the 90s, we actually see this movement get really, really ugly and turn into what we're seeing today with Doge and, the dismantling of the government, which is, anti-tax turns into anti-government very, very quickly.
Yeah, and
that is where we are.
Yeah, and it kind of started with the whole Tea Party thing. It is like, when a Republican's in office, spend as much money as you can and run up the debt as fast as you can. And then when a Democrat comes into office, yell and scream about the national debt and demand that they dial back social programs.